grateful to the professor for the rich lecture, which I'm sure will be the subject of a book that will be well received. He mentioned Desmond Tutu a few times, and I've never seen a man so blessed. On September 12, last week, he gave a big lecture in Indianapolis. I was amazed about his strength, both at private dinner and in the public speech. He's just so blessed. Is Professor Tushab here from Kansas? Tushab? Where are you? We have a visiting professor from Kansas. Welcome, Professor Tushab. And just coming in is Professor Limfos, the Dean of African Studies. Thank you. Thanks so much. We are going to take questions, but before we open it up, I just want to bring out 3 elements from the lecture. First is the element of the excellent biographies, things that I'm learning for the first time, how the professor is able to connect the activities of students with what they did in subsequent years, and there are some students here, and I'm sure you will take some lessons from that, how what you do is very important. Second is the issue of differential impact on education. The various paths that people pursue, some going into politics and some becoming wealthy investors. And the third is the issue of soft diplomacy. This is one example of soft diplomacy. Instead of using military force and drones, how you can use money to train people we benefit from the opportunities you have provided. So question time. So I think it's best if you write down all the questions so that you can respond just one time. Let me give you this.
However you like to do it.
No, it's best to just.
Should I write down questions?
Yeah, because I don't know whether there'll be questions or whether people are tired, but let me start the first one. So, why are students today not very active? Let me write that one down. Why some of the students who are here, why are they not politically active as the examples you have given? If you have questions, please, I will pass on the microphone. Questions, don't be shy. Yes? Yes. You can introduce yourself if you want to. Sorry about that.
I'm actually in American Studies, Eric Covey. Thank you, Dr. Falola. I had a question, actually. I wonder if you could speak to any kind of visa or other difficulties the students had coming from South Africa to the United States, and also if any of them remained in the U.S. after their education, especially at the kind of 1993-94 period.
The last part of the keyword was
Stayed behind after the education.
stay here.
Yeah.
Questions, please? Questions? Okay, I'm coming there. Nevi Hood, professor of South African literature. He also presented this lecture some 4 years ago.
I'm loud. Thank you. That was very, very wonderful. And as a person who sort of came to political awareness in South Africa in the 1980s, I'm kind of overwhelmed with associations and questions. So I could have 100 questions. So I'm going to try and narrow them to 2.
I'll probably refer them back to you.
Okay, no. I don't. The potentially apocryphal remark by Mandela too.
Yeah.
A lot of students also went to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
A lot of people went to Eastern Bloc countries because actually the Eastern Bloc was much more sympathetic to the anti-apartheid cause than the US. So I'm just wondering, is there any work that tracks their trajectories? Like what would this study look like if it did a comparison between, let's say, people who ended up in Bulgaria and people who ended up in Ohio? So I just wonder, I'd like to hear more. We're just thinking about other places that saw similar experiences. And then the second one, your sort of joke about typewriters. Because I think that gets to the visa question. I mean, the way these activists circulated, you know, they went to church meetings, there were community groups, there was a privileging of kind of face-to-face and embodied forms of activism. Whereas I think today one is much, and I could be wrong because I'm a bit of a Luddite, but I think student activism consists of pushing like on Facebook.
I was wondering if there was a specific teacher that instigated that, if the students there were especially aware why or how was this movement originated in a high school and not at a university?
Hi, I was wondering, since a lot of them maybe weren't in school before applying or had different situations going on, what was considered in their applications and how do they choose which candidates got to be a part of the SAEP?
All right, so I'll do what I can. So many of these, the answer is I don't know. But as to visa problems, all I can tell you, wherever that came from, the only person I spoke to who mentioned visa problems was Saki Makozoma, who had spent 5 years on Robben Island. So his coming was delayed by 1 year. No one else mentioned having any difficulty. And that issue doesn't come up in the longer reports that try to do comprehensive survey, both of SAEP and of the South African EOC, which also, well, that wouldn't have to do with visas, but yeah, no. So as far as I know, it wasn't a huge problem, although clearly was for some people. Apparently 95% of those who came on the program went back to South Africa, so 5% stayed. And you might have thought that even a higher number would have stayed in the 1980s. And especially given that quite a few people did stay to do further degrees before going back to South Africa. But in fact, this 95% number comes out, and that's considered a big success by those who organized the program. Neville, that is a very good question. It's sort of entered the back of my mind about students who studied in the Eastern Bloc, but no, I'm not aware of work, but there may well be work on those. Reminds me, though, of, yeah, I mean, I'm sure, Jason, you would have run to people in Namibia who studied in various Eastern Bloc countries and so forth, yeah. So yeah, there's an opening for research for anyone there. And I'm intrigued by the question about the sort of more personal level of activism. In fact, when I started thinking about differences between the British movement and the American movement, I was thinking, well, the British movement was very centralized. There was one organization to which people belonged, and much more decentralized in the US, which is sort of how things tend to work in the US most of the time. But, so how would that work? Because they didn't have email, they didn't have, they couldn't tweet, they couldn't text, they couldn't do anything. And even long distance phone calls were quite expensive. But somehow people did it. And traveling around South Africa also, not cheap. And most people didn't have phones and so forth. So, maybe I'm not sure what you're getting at, though. Are you suggesting that that was perhaps better for the possibilities of activism? Which maybe it was, I don't know. Well, yeah. Well, but was it you who mentioned Occupy? Because I think for me, the big difference there is that with the sanctions and divestment movement, there was a very focused issue about a very focused place that you could learn about, at least at a basic level, in not too much time, whereas Occupy was almost trying to say everything about everything, which made it appealing but also hard to sustain, I would guess. How were people chosen for SAEP? There was a long and involved application process that took up to a year to complete. I don't know the details of what went into the program. I know that they wanted people who were academically sound and could work well in American universities, who they thought could handle being away from home for a long period of time, because in most cases they weren't going to go back and forth. Again, it was too expensive. So it'd be very long, and some of them that meant being away from their spouses or whatever. They, again, were looking for this quality of leadership potential, you know, the potential to be a future leader. But I don't know about sort of specific academic qualifications or the like, though I assume they did have some specific numbers in mind. They did interviews conducted both by South African organizers and American organizers who came out to join in those interviews. So there were several rounds of the application process and then finally the interview. The Soweto revolt, why high school students? I mean, I think it's really the way that high school students had been fired up by the Black consciousness movement. And did teachers play a role? I'm not at all an expert on the Soweto uprising, but my impression is that teachers came in after the fact in a supportive role or else in an oppositional role, but many of them in a supportive role, but were not involved in the initial plans for the demonstration, which was planned as a one-day demonstration against the language policy. Well, it might have gone on had there not been any change in the language policy, which there wouldn't have been. But I think, you know, it was something about the way in which imposing that language requirement of Afrikaans seemed to high school students to diminish their opportunities, because they were going to be taught now by students who were not themselves proficient in Afrikaans in many cases, in subjects that students needed in order to qualify for specific jobs. And the combination of, you know, wanting to seize their own destiny and the way in which that seemed to cut off opportunity fired up a number of students all at once. That's the best I can do to answer that. So, Carver has a question. Sorry, wouldn't want to, you can ask me at dinner.
You want to ask a question?
Okay. Oh, you need this? Okay. One more. All good? Maybe we get someone else to answer.
Okay, this is a historical question, not unlike Neville's, but the sanctions movement, the sanctions divestment movement against South African apartheid really has become the ideal, the model for sanctions. But sanctions have had a very checkered history since then, against Cuba, against Iraq, against Iran, and so on. And now the BDS movement, the boycott divestment movement against Israel in support of Palestine, harkens back to the South African ideal. And I wonder if you could comment on why it might be that South Africa has been perhaps the greatest supporter of the BDS movement.
Hold on. We take the last question just to respect the audience, and be patient. We will soon let you go and have your dinner. Be patient, please.
I'm sorry. When you were answering one of the questions, it made me think of something. You said that Moctezuma said that he accredited the program for keeping him out of jail. So I was wondering why the government didn't stop the program internally.
That's a good question.
Thanks. All right, I'll try to be brief, as I'm sure you're hungry. The checkered history of sanctions, definitely. I think what's different about South Africa, and that may relate to their support for the sanctions divestment movement relating to Israel and Palestine, is that the movement to impose sanctions on South Africa originated in South Africa and was supported by broad mass organized organizations, popular support organizations. And we can't say that about Cuba, we can't say it about Iraq and so forth. And so I assume that it has something to do with that history as well as a history of mutual support from the Palestinian movement. That's the best I could do to answer that. And why didn't South Africa stop the SAEP? I think the apartheid is just, it was, as I think Neville could tell us, was just full of contradictions. When I first went to South Africa in 1986 as a traveler and was just poking around in bookstores, I found the complete works of Karl Marx. I found a book called Torture in South Africa, all kinds of things that you would not imagine to exist under a state of emergency in a country that was fighting and was also very repressive, torturing people, imprisoning people, censoring all kinds of art and literature. But so that's one level, just the contradictions. It was just like something they didn't bother to deal with. On another, I think they were very happy to have someone like Saki Moctezuma out of the country. And that would be the other part of it. Thank you very much for coming.
Please, 1 second. Let me thank the professor. Please, on your behalf and on the behalf of the University of Texas at Austin, I just want to extend our gratitude to the professor and for the good lecture, which is always very well attended. People used to think that when you do events on Africa, you won't get an audience, but that has not been the case. These events are always very well attended. And we've even been able to use Bass Hall for some events, which is one of the biggest on campus. So thanks for coming. We now have a South African cluster on campus. Shippo introduced the professor, Evia, Neville, Barbara is becoming a very formidable South African cluster that will be providing enormous opportunities. And UT is co-hosting a conference in South Africa in the first week of July next year as part of broadening these interactions. We normally record this lecture and we put them to an international audience with the permission of the speaker, and we use them for all sorts of purposes. We have a conference on Saturday. The participants are arriving. Some are arriving tonight, some are arriving tomorrow. It's a one-day conference on images and the nation state, focusing on the work of an artist. The conference will be holding in this building, the first floor, for those of you who are interested, bringing artists and art historians to look at how images illustrate ideas of the nation. and development. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next year.